thanks to all of you for coming out and hearing our panels and hearing about sports and arts. And I won't sell it anymore, but I do have a slogan I want to share with you, which is that our public schools are the future of our democracy. And that's why I feel so committed to them. In terms of what I would say to the mayor, I would try to make him aware of the fact that, in my view, a couple or more of our segments of the real estate business in New York are hurting. You can't help, if you walk down the street, not to notice the very high level of retail vacancies. If you're in the luxury condominium business, as I am, you know that the velocity of sales for apartments over $2 million has slowed significantly. This is all happening in the background of an economy which is otherwise doing rather well. And I think the city has to do some hard thinking about why this is occurring, what the role, the intersection of our real estate tax policies and its effect, for instance, on retail tenants who get enormous bills that they don't expect because of increases in real estate taxes. And the mayor needs to recognize that some of his very important and very useful and commendable social programs are coming from the money that the real estate industry in New York provides. So he better take care of us, or the golden goose. The golden goose isn't feeling so well today, and he needs to recognize that.
Last November, we sat here a few days before the election with the thought then, the prevailing thought was that Hillary Clinton would be elected president. Francis, what happened? What lessons can be learned from the 2016 presidential election?
I think the couple of takeaways, I happen to be an admirer of Hillary and I've spent a fair amount of time with her on an individual basis. So I know a side of her personality that not everybody gets to see because she doesn't convey in the media that well. A vote expert once said to me, do you know what people vote? They don't vote their self-interest, is what we think they vote. They vote their gut. They vote their emotional response to candidates. And unfortunately, Hillary didn't pass that test as well. She passed it, but not as well as she needed to. So that kind of visceral aspect to our candidates are important. The other thing that we need to do is we need to recognize that the electoral college system is not working unless you live in Kentucky. I think we should start a serious movement to bring back the popular vote as our presidential deciding mechanism. I don't think Tajikistan tells Russia what to do. And I think in the United States, if the smaller states start somehow disbalancing the situation with the larger states, that really destabilizes our political and social unity, which is essential to the progress of the country.
With politics out of the way now, let's drill down on your contrarian strategy. Francis, what are the key principles of this strategy, this contrarian investment strategy, which you've formulated over the last 50-plus years?
Well, I think in a nutshell, it's to think differently than the obvious. I gave an example this morning, and of course, I think probably there are many people in the room who did the same. We'll see who passed the test. Question is, did you check your coat downstairs or did you bring it with you? I decided not to check it downstairs because I have a time constraint and wanted to be able to leave quickly and was afraid there would be a long line. Now, I may be wrong, but so not following the obvious, going to the coat room and checking your coat is an example of contrarian thinking. So it's not thinking the way the crowd does and trying to make independent, highly informed decisions based on your view of the markets.
The art of the deal seems to be in vogue in Washington. How does your contrarian strategy align with or diverge from what's going on in Washington?
I don't pretend to understand what's occurring in Washington. I don't pretend to understand presidential politics, and I'll take a pass on that one, except tell you that I was recently interviewed and they said, what would you say to Donald Trump if you were with him for a few minutes? And I would say, do you really believe the policies that you're promulgating, or is it some complex political strategy that's hard to discern? So I don't get it. I don't think that is what I'm talking about when I think about contrarian ideas, which are ideas that are highly informed and where one sees a different path than the status quo, but one does it relying on a carefully thought out business plan.
How about specifically on the tax proposal?
Well, I think the tax proposal is another thing that I don't get. I think it's going to have very significant effects on the national economy. Let's take it in parts. It clearly is going to hurt places like New York, California, the so-called high-tax states. But that's not the only one it's going to hurt, because effectively the cost of living here is going to go up dramatically by the delta of the deductibility of our taxes, which we'll no longer have. It's going to cause economic contraction here. And excuse me, but we send a great deal of money to Washington, to the federal budget, so that even though it may somehow enhance in the sense that they'll get a little extra revenue by not allowing that deductibility, if we go into a deep dive, as for instance our real estate will, as people just say it's too expensive to live here when you think about it on a tax basis, or affects our economy otherwise, we're going to be sending a lot less money to Washington. And so I don't know what figures they're using in their calculations, but that's a negative. Secondly, I don't understand this whole corporate tax thing with the desperation to lower the corporate rate to 20%. As far as I know, our national economy and the companies in it are doing very, very well under the current tax regime. And to me, this is just kind of a bizarre giveaway for no particular reason, and for that we're going to go through this gross distortion in a number of different areas of our current tax system. So I don't get it. The economy is on balance doing great. Leave it alone. If we want corporations to bring offshore profits back to the U.S., we should incentivize that activity. We don't have to lower taxes on all corporate income in order to do that. We want to give them a lower tax where they, on foreign income, we can do it and incentivize their bringing that money back to the U.S. So that's another kind of red herring that I don't get. If all of this results in higher deficits, and the administration is itself projecting I think a $1.5 billion increase in the deficits, deficits normally equal higher interest rates. Equal inflation equals higher interest rates, long term. I think our interest rate environment is the most important driver of our economy. And if we play around with that, we're going to be having a very negative effect, far less than whatever incentive they think this lower corporate tax will occur. Zero estate taxes. Look, my family will pay significant taxes. And of course, I'd like them to pay less. But I don't really, I think that there's that there are two, I don't think zero taxes are necessary. I think current taxes are high. Be nice to do what, for instance, the Canadians do, bring the rate down to equal capital gain, and do that slowly over time. As with a lot of the administration's policies, this would create a very, an unintended consequence. High estate taxes lead people to make a lot of charitable donations. If you think about our education infrastructure, our colleges, if you think about our medical institutions, all driven by those philanthropic efforts, and you suddenly disincentivize people from supporting that, that's going to have a huge economic effect on the country. I mean, I'm sure you've all been around, and this is not in the urban areas. I mean, you see the colleges and the medical centers that are in some of the smaller regions of the country. So that's another unintended, very negative aspect. The one aspect, to the extent that there are lower taxes that narrow the wealth gap, that's good for lower income people, but we don't have to do what we're doing in order to accomplish that. So I don't think it's a good tax proposal.
Where do you see the undervalued investment opportunities now these days?
We are essentially, it always changes, and so we're always on the lookout for new ideas, but once we identify a niche, we usually follow it until other people start piling in and cap rates get bid down and pricing goes up. Three areas that we're working in right now and have been for a while. One are underoccupied office buildings. So if we see an office building that has 50% occupancy and it's in an 85% occupied submarket, we say, well, what's wrong with this building? And often there are clear reasons: lack of TI money available, unstable ownership, poor marketing, et cetera. We feel, and the discounts on those deals tend to be very, very strong. So just as an example, we're under contract in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for a 600,000-foot office building at sub $40 a foot. You know, it's only probably 40% occupied. Again, in an 85% submarket, we think we can bring it back to stability and health. And when we do, we end up with a double-digit cap rate, which is where we're looking to end up. Similarly, less in the underoccupied area, there are certain market segments that fall out of favor. Right now, clearly retail is one of those. And we've been a heavy buyer of retail throughout the country because we feel it's been overly discounted. We know about e-commerce. We understand that it's a growing part of the market. But we also know that bricks and mortar retail, at least according to the statistics that we see, actually is not shrinking. There are more stores opening than closing. It's a small margin, maybe 1%, rather than the overall 3 or 4% growth in the retail market. The greater share is going to the growth in e-commerce. The rate of growth in e-commerce is much higher, but actually bricks and mortar retailing is not actually shrinking, which is most people's perception. And all of this has resulted in cap rates of between 9.5 and in some cases as high as 12 in certain particular malls. And we think those are very, very rich cap rates. So we're a buyer of those assets and have bought a large number of them. We also look at the international market, not everywhere, not countries in which we perceive sovereign risk as being a problem, but we have owned property in Europe and Germany for a long time. We consider that a stable country. And more recently, we've been buying in Holland because that was a market where they had a sustained recession. Banks were reducing their real estate exposure. There was no financing for a large segment of the Dutch real estate market. Prices collapsed. Local players don't have any firepower because they're all suffering. And that's a good situation for us to go in. And in the last 18 or 24 months, we've been able to buy 25 or so office buildings throughout Holland. And we think it's a good place to be. And as long as that gap exists, we will continue to be a buyer in that market. Banks become liquid again. Other players recapitalize. Cap rates will compress. Right now, we are getting probably a net of TIs and commissions close to 8. And that's in a market where interest rates are traditionally 100 or 150 basis points lower than the U.S. So it'd be like getting a 9s, mid-9s, net unlevered return on assets. So those are some of the markets that we're looking that we're active in, but we're looking every day, and we also pick sort of one-off stabilized assets where we see cap rates that meet our criteria, which are not complicated. I mean, generally we're looking for a net 8, unlevered 8% after reserves on the full capital stack. We can achieve that. We're interested even in stabilized assets.
We're down to our final question. We could go on for hours. There's a lot to cover over this storied career. But to put it in context, Francis, what would you say your career batting average is?
Well, I always tell people it's certainly not 1,000. I put my batting average, although I've never computed it, at 650. And as everybody here who's a baseball fan knows, 650 ain't bad. I don't think anybody in the real estate business bats 1,000. Maybe there's somebody who's only done 1 or 2 deals. But it's a cyclical business, and I think the challenge is to pay a lot of attention to your problems, minimize those problems and those losses when they are losses, and maximize your wins. So I'm handicapping at about 650.